Hello, it's Charlotte, and today I'm visiting a museum that I have waited 14 years to go to. I wanted to share my thoughts on the attraction and how it went, and whether I feel differently about England's most famous and beloved poet. But today I'm not actually here to visit because I want to learn more about William. I am here because of his sister, Dorothy Wordsworth. She is also who I studied at university. In today's vlog, we're visiting Dove Cottage in Grasmere, and it was the home of both the Wordsworth. And it's a place where many incredible poems, diaries, letters and journals were created. It was a place of real literary heritage and importance. So in England, children and adults are generally mostly taught about William Wordsworth. He is majoritively who we learn about, but Dorothy is an extraordinary writer and diarist herself, and I was fortunate enough to be taught about her and introduced to her work whilst I was at university. Dorothy was an extraordinary writer and diarist herself, and I was super curious to see if the museum here would have any acknowledgement or celebration of her work alongside her brothers. Dorothy is largely unknown outside certain academic circles and even to many English literature students, and she was vastly overshadowed by her famous brother. But what you should also know about her is that her unpublished writings deeply influenced and inspired her brother's own poetry. This is a lesser known aspect of literary history, and I was hopeful that the museum would acknowledge perhaps the literary debt that I believe William owes his sister. And that might sound a little controversial, but I will try to explain why and how I feel this way. But to start with, I just want to mention briefly that I have always really loved 18th century writings, and especially female writers inside and outside of this time period. From a precociously young age, I loved reading women's novels, essays, letters, poetry, non-fiction, literary theory and criticism. It has been one of my main and favourite continued interests, and I was so lucky to have also studied Dorothy Wordsworth as part of a women's 18th century writing programme when I was at university. I also formerly for a number of years worked as a rare books librarian, and I also worked at a research facility for 18th century studies for a couple of years, and I was so excited for these many reasons particularly to come and visit this museum. And I wanted to briefly talk about the period in which Dorothy was writing in, because I think it obviously provides a real context to why her work is of so much value, but also how political and how interesting it makes her diaries and her letters. So Dorothy was writing in the period of Romanticism, and this was a literary and aesthetic movement that started in the late 1700s through to approximately 1850. And it was largely a rejection of the previously popular neoclassical styles and modes of art. It instead celebrated the beauty of the natural world, the imagination, one's self, and these newly innovative ideas about individualism, and they had an emphasis on simplicity. There was a shift in the language and in literature and in poetry from these higher styles of art, things that were perceived to be more highbrow, and there were these attempts instead by poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge and Blake and Keats to really use simplistic language and simplistic art forms while also still exploring mystical ideas, folklore, the pastoral themes of sensibility, but to try and reach a more natural understanding and a natural way of creating art. We also see in this period a really early examples of fantasy novels and horror novels starting to creep in, especially with the Gothic further on in this period. And Romanticism bloomed across all intersectionalities of art, literature, music and architecture, and this was the context for which Dorothy and William were writing. It was a really febrile period for the arts. Dorothy and William were living at this cottage from 1799 to 1808, and they were very much the living embodiment of the Romantic aesthetics, both in their creative endeavours, their lifestyle, their adoration of nature and their interests, and also their characteristics. And this was really a properly romantic aesthetic that they were living. And what I've really come to love about Dorothy's journals and their writings is that her appreciation of nature was beautiful, and she had this attention to detail and the minutiae of what she saw in the Lake District, and she captured this quiet domesticity, these beautiful little vignettes of everyday life that were really evocatively captured. And she is so poetic in the way sometimes that she describes and sees her world. and that really makes her worthy of reading and consideration. The texts that we read at university were the Grasmere and our Foxton journals. I had the Oxford edition, and these were journals written from 1797 through to, I believe, 1800. So Dorothy's work encapsulates much of the zeitgeist of the period of Romanticism due to her shared values of her brother and the beauty of the Lake District and landscapes like we've already talked about. But her writing can also be considered unintentionally political, because much of how she wrote was in a personal, newer style. It was these newer modalities of thinking and perceiving the natural world. And Dorothy captured in her diaries the romantic values of feeling and how she was emotively expressing herself from the natural world and from these aspects of domesticity. Dorothy seemed to reject the growing urbanisation of a lot of the towns and the areas in England at this period, and she preferred the wildness of the lakes, but also the intimacy of her smaller immediate family and her smaller literary connections that her and her brother had. She was also writing in the semi-private form of her diary, using I, me, the self. It was self-reflections. She was centering herself in these narratives. They were her own opinions, her own impressions of her life, the works, the conversations, and the interactions that she was having. And they show a real artistic value to that introspection and the self-reflexivity that she is showing in her writing. And whilst we don't know if Dorothy ever had literary ambitions for herself, she was certainly never published in her lifetime. It makes me feel a little sad that she isn't more known in comparison to her brother, when they are clearly just both so equally gifted. There's a fascinating quote by Coleridge, another one of England's greatest poets, and also a friend of both the Wordsworth, where he acknowledges Dorothy's gift for writing. And he says, "She was the sister of our great poet, a woman of genius as well as manifold acquirements." And he goes on to say that she would have been as great a poet as William. And I think that is such a testament to her gift for her writing. There is also a real rhythm and cadence sometimes captured in her journal entries, and this is later emulated in the poetic form of William's works, where he draws from her own writing for his own poetry and for his own inspiration. And we see multiple examples from her diaries and journals being directly drawn on as source material by her brother. So I did love at the museum that they showed these comparisons side to side. They did not show William in isolation in that respect. Like, the extracts of her diaries were shown directly next to poetry and pieces that she had complemented, if we want to use that word. One of the most famous examples of this is when Dorothy wrote about the daffodils in the Lake District. I believe it was by Lake Windermere, and this extract that she had written in her diary directly influenced and was copied by her brother William in his probably most famous poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. And it's very interesting to see these side by side in the museum, and I was grateful to see her work put like that. But a tiny part of me couldn't help but feel a little bit saddened that another brilliant, semi-unknown female writer was only known in the context of her relationship with her brother and the literary relationship that those two had between each other. And there's no doubt that her brother was a literary genius, but there is such a wealth of material that he took from her journals and her diaries. And the museum does subtly acknowledge this, and he does credit this, but it emphasises a collaborative relationship between them. And I feel like that is true in spirit, but I feel like this collaboration is so one-sided. Dorothy didn't publish, didn't write, didn't share anything creatively with the world, and that's absolutely fine on her part, but her voice clearly inspired William, and her observations clearly shaped his work, and the influence for that only flows in one direction, and that's why I feel a tiny bit sad. And I don't say any of this to disparage Dove Cottage, because I'm so relieved that there's a whole section on Dorothy Wordsworth here. They have Dorothy walks, they sell her books in the shop, they talk about her at length in the museum. It's just, it's always going to be one of those things based on the context and the relationship that the Wordsworths had together. There's a tiny part of me that always feels a little bit sad that she is known as Wordsworth's sister, and I hope that this video could offer you a bit more information about her, and also encourage you, if you're interested in reading women's writings, to go away and look at her journals, because they're available for free online. They're available on Project Gutenberg because they're out of copyright, and if you're interested in pastoral or nature writing or 18th century writings, they just might be something that you could dip into and enjoy reading. So thank you for listening to this, and I hope by sharing this with you today, you might be inspired to go see this beautiful attraction and go see what is being paid tribute to with another female writer.